Hey there, let's talk about the Canon R5C and why I bought it for the third time. That's right, the third time. So I haven't talked about the R5C on this channel in quite a while, but I did recently pick one up, and so I want to talk about why I sold it the first few times, why I picked it up this time, and why I think it might be a good camera for you to pick up as well. So we're gonna have a little bit of a chat here and talk about the camera because I had a lot of thoughts about this, obviously. So I did buy this camera right after it came out in 2022. I made a lot of videos about it, testing it and using it and all that kind of stuff. And we're gonna get into all of my reasons for selling it and buying it and all that kind of stuff. But this camera has changed a lot since it came out with firmware updates. Now, let me talk about some of those improvements first of all. The first thing I want to mention is with the Netflix firmware that came out a while ago, they basically improved the dynamic range by getting more highlight information in C-Log3 in the XF-AVZ codec, which is very much welcomed. There's been a lot of autofocus improvements on this, and it's been also very welcomed, including some of the most recent updates. There was a lot of autofocus improvements, which has been nice to have. They also added an energy saving mode to help with the battery life, which is one of the things that this camera really struggles with, of course, is battery life. Now, the energy saving mode should have come out a long time ago, and it is rather limited. You have to have certain things off, and you can't do everything, but it is an option for some situations. I'm glad it came in there. There's also some new profiles in here for shooting baked-in footage. For example, I like the Canon 709 one when I'm streaming, so I don't have to worry about putting together a LUT or anything like that, or if you're trying to get images right out of camera. I was never really a huge fan of the YDR picture profile in the Canon Cinema operating system, but I really do like the Canon 709. It's got a lot more contrast and saturation, and it's pretty nice right out of camera. So my main issues with this camera, after owning it for a few times, there was three main things, and I bet you can guess what they are. First of all, the battery life is a joke in this camera, especially if you're shooting above 24 frames per second, but even in 24 frames per second, the battery life is pretty bad. And I hope that whenever they come out with another version of this camera or something down the line, that they put a bigger battery in it. This battery in here is really designed for photography cameras. So that was my biggest thing, was battery life. The next thing was, of course, you can probably guess it, no C-Log2. And because of not having C-Log2, we have less dynamic range. Now, I would love to see C-Log2 in this camera because the C70 has C-Log2, the C300 Mark III, the C500 Mark II. C-Log2 should be in all of their cinema cameras from now moving forwards, in my opinion. And there's been a lot of explaining about this and everything, but I know you can shoot in 8K RAW on this camera and then interpret it in your computer as C-Log2, but this camera does not shoot C-Log2. And the third one, micro HDMI. So those are my three main gripes with this camera: was the bad battery life, no C-Log2 and having less dynamic range, and then the micro HDMI. So has Canon addressed what bothers me about this camera? Well, the battery life, sort of, but not really, right? With that new power saving mode, it helps a little bit. It's no C-Log2. They didn't give us C-Log2, but they did increase the dynamic range somehow in this camera in C-Log3 in the XF-AVZ codec. I don't know how they did that. And it's also perplexing to me that the dynamic range has increased in this camera over the R5, even though they have the same sensor and processor. I'm curious to stack those two cameras up against each other for dynamic range, and maybe I'll make a video about that. So if you're interested in that, let me know down below. The micro HDMI, of course, you can't do anything about that. You can't update that with firmware. But those things are my main gripes, and you might be wondering, Josh, okay, Canon really hasn't addressed those. Like, what made you pick up the camera this time? Well, this camera is a fantastic studio camera. So as a studio camera, those three things don't really bother me, right? I don't care about battery life because I can plug it in. I don't really care so much about dynamic range because I'm shooting in a controlled lighting situation. I don't really have a lot of dynamic range in this shot. And micro HDMI, although is annoying, the camera's not moving around, so it's not as much of an issue. Now, micro HDMI is definitely not as reliable as HDMI or SDI, but in the studio, things aren't moving around. It's not really as big of a deal. So what are some things about the R5C that I really love and why I wanted to pick it up again? Well, first of all, it's full frame. Shooting on the C70 quite a bit and in the Canon ecosystem with their cinema cameras, I personally prefer full frame if it is an option, right? I can definitely shoot on Super 35 and that whole argument, but if I have an option between Super 35 and full frame, personally, I prefer full frame. It gives you more control over depth of field. You can get wider images with certain lenses, and then also you usually get better in low light. So again, it's full frame, really nice to have. It has an oversampled 4K up to 60 frames per second from the full 8K, which is awesome. The R5 only did the oversampled 4K up to 30 frames per second. You didn't get it in 60 frames per second. The only cameras that you can do that in are the newer ones, which was like the R3, the R6 Mark II, and the R8 will give you an oversampled 4K up to 60 frames per second from the 6K resolution. It also shoots in 8K RAW if you want to do that up to 60 frames per second. Personally, I don't touch that stuff because the files are absolutely massive and they're really hard to edit on your computer. The old school Canon RAW codecs are just really tough to edit and absolutely massive. So yes, you can get the most dynamic range, the most flexibility in post if you shoot in 8K RAW, but it's a huge file and, as I said, hard to edit. I really do like the XF ABC codec, both in the R5C and the C70. It gives you a lot of flexibility. The files are manageable, fairly easy to edit in your computer. One of the biggest things going for the R5C is the cinema operating system. Now, as someone who focuses primarily on videography, having a camera that is set up to be a video camera is really, really nice. So in addition to just the whole menu system, the things I love are shutter angle, false color, and waveform. And you still get to use the fantastic operating system in the still side of this camera if you are shooting stills. So unlike some of the other cameras where, you know, like the FX3, which I absolutely love, or the A7S III, it's basically a modified stills menu that they're using for video. But this was really the first camera, when you flip the switch, it goes from stills focused to video focused. I think it's really cool. And they've actually decreased the time between switching. And that was another one of the complaints. Now in the cinema operating system, and just in addition to how it works and everything, one thing I love is the autofocus that's in the R5C. Now when it came out, I think a lot of people were critical about the autofocus because it didn't have some of the features of the autofocus from the R5 mirrorless autofocus system. But one of the features I love the most is the face-only autofocus, which you can find in Canon cinema cameras like the C70, C300 Mark III, even the C200 has really reliable face-only autofocus. And this is fantastic for interviews, talking heads, stuff like this. When it misses focus or can't figure it out, it doesn't just jump to the background, it just holds the focus plane. And it just creates a really consistent look, and it's super reliable. I love the face-only autofocus. And they just recently added the back of head autofocus feature in the Canon cinema camera, so that's cool too. The R5C also has a dual base ISO of 800 and 3200 in C-Log3, and as far as I know, I think it's the only Canon camera that has a formal dual base ISO, which is really cool. Now, the full frame RFL lenses look awesome on the R5C, and I own a few of them, and I've owned them for years. Not all of them for years, but the 15-35, the 24-70, and within the last year I picked up the 100-500, and I love those lenses. I love the way they look, and this camera really pulls out the full potential in them for shooting video. Another thing is you can control the noise reduction in the camera, which is not the case in some of the Sony cameras like the A7S III and the FX3, A7 IV, the other mirrorless cameras you might be shooting video on. Having the ability to control noise reduction in the camera is great because you have more control over your image, but you can also get a sharper image and then apply noise reduction as you want in post. Of course, you can apply it in camera too, and I made a video about the noise reduction modes in this camera, which I'll leave linked down below if you're curious how to set it up to get the best image out of your camera. It also takes power through USB-C power delivery, and you don't need a dummy battery. I know this is more common for cameras that have come out in the last year or two, but the fact that I don't need a dummy battery, most of us have extra charging bricks laying around. You can plug in with USB-C or plug in with a battery. Super handy. CF Express B cards, which I much prefer over SD cards because they are more reliable, they are faster, and they're actually cheaper at the moment versus the V90 SD cards, which I buy. So the Angelbird 512 gig card, which I use in this camera and my R5, is a great card, and as I said, it's cheaper and it's faster and all that kind of stuff. So I really do prefer using the CF Express B cards. Now, in addition to all of that, most of you know watching this, I shoot on Canon and Sony and also Red. And I personally, if I had to choose between Canon and Sony for shooting people, I generally will prefer Canon. And this is based on skin tones and the color and just the way it looks. And I know that you can grade anything to look like anything for the most part if you put the time in. But for someone like myself who's doing a lot of quick turnaround stuff and YouTube, and I'm not a professional colorist, for me, I personally like the way people look when I'm shooting with Canon over Sony. So that's just a personal preference. So if I'm shooting inside the studio, which is what I bought this camera for, I'm shooting myself, I prefer to shoot on Canon. One other thing I want to mention about the battery life is that personally, I don't like rigging up cameras that much. I try to keep them as small and compact and simple as possible, but there's this new accessory from SmallRig, which I made a video about, and I'll leave it linked down below. I love this because of how small and simple it allows you to put a V-mount battery on a camera like this. I know there's other power options, but I do really like this. And so you can take one of their little V-mount batteries and pop it on like this, and this is like basically the whole setup. So this is Arca Swiss on the bottom. So if you have either a cage on your R5C or just an Arca Swiss on the bottom here, you can just pop this on and basically this is your whole setup. So if you need longer run times, you can use one of these batteries. You can also plug in accessories like monitors and stuff like that, or charge your cell phone with this. And this is great too because these batteries you can charge with USB-C, so you don't need a D-tap charger. So if you're interested in this, as I said, I'll leave that video linked down below. So those are some of my reasons why I love the R5C. Let me explain why you might want to pick up an R5C this year. Well, if you're in the Canon ecosystem and let's say you have a C70, it cuts really well with the C70 when you set both cameras to C-Log 3. I did this in my studio and the footage like cut really, really well together. When you have similar matching lenses on the two cameras, they cut really well together. So it's a great B cam to the C70 or the C300 Mark III, which has the same sensor. Now, if you are a small crew or a solo operator, let's say you're out on a gig and you're doing an interview, you're doing a 2-camera interview or something like that, and you have a C300 Mark III or you have a C70, and you got the R5C to pair it up with that camera for an A/B cam, this will pair really well. And also you can easily pull this camera out and take a couple photos. If you need a couple headshots or BTS photos or anything like that, you have an R5 in here, which is an incredible photography camera. So it is a very flexible camera as a B cam, especially that it matches so well with the other cameras. Now, for the price, this is probably the best time to buy the R5C because the price has changed a lot. When it came out, it was $4,500, which I thought was expensive for the camera. Then they raised it to $4,800, which I thought was way too expensive for the camera. Then they lowered it to, it's been up and down a lot, to $4,300, and right now it's actually on sale for $4,000. So at $4,000, I think this makes this a lot more competitive, but also the used market. So if you can find one of these used, maybe around $3,500, now we're talking a pretty solid deal on a very, very powerful camera. There's a lot of use cases for this. As I said, it is a really powerful hybrid. One thing in particular, I think this would be great for if you're doing real estate because you can do unbelievable photography because it's an R5, and obviously great video because it has a lot of dynamic range. You pair this with like the RF15 to 35, one camera, super powerful, you're good to go. So there's gonna be some criticism about maybe picking up an R5C because of the age of the camera. Now, this camera only came out last year in early 2022. So at the time of recording this, it's about 1.5 years old, but it is based on the R5, which came out in late 2020, and so it is a little bit older than that, but it's not a super old camera. And the next thing you might be thinking about if you're thinking about investing in the R5C is like, what's coming up for Canon? Now, lately, I've seen Canon has started spending money on influencer marketing for this camera. They've been paying some content creators to make content about the R5C, to talk about it. They send them the camera, say, go make something. All the creators have been upfront with it and all that kind of stuff. So I think they're trying to push this camera and trying to get it into more people's hands. They've also put out a statement that said they did sell more of these than they expected. And that was some of the motivation to potentially bring out an R5C Mark II. The other thing is they updated all of their Canon cinema cameras in terms of firmware lately. So the R5C, the C70, the C300 Mark III, the C500 Mark II. So I think their lineup is pretty steady right now. And I don't think we're gonna see any new cinema cameras coming out anytime soon. Also, when I was at NAB earlier this year, I was talking to a Canon sales rep and they told me to not expect any RF cinema cameras for a while. So I think for the time being, what we have is what we're gonna have for the near future. So investing in the R5C, I don't think they're gonna come out with something super new right away. Now there are rumors, as you probably know if you're watching this, about the R5 Mark II, and now a new rumor about the potential R5C Mark II, but from what I saw in the rumors, the R5C Mark II won't be coming out for 2 years. So this camera is gonna be pretty relevant. Now, when the R5 II comes out, of course, I don't have any information about it, but I think it will be more photography focused because there is an R5C Mark II coming out. So I'd be really curious how the video specs compare in the R5 Mark II with, for example, the R5C Mark II. But either way, I think this camera is gonna be a current camera for Canon for the near future. So how does the R5C stack up with some of the other offerings? Well, first of all, the biggest question mark that I see all the time is R5C or C70. I made a detailed video about that a while ago, but I'll leave that video linked down below. You also might be curious about how the R5C stacks up against the FX3 or the A7S III. Again, I made a video comparing the R5C and the A7S III. I'll leave that video linked down below as well. Now, back to sort of what I talked about at the beginning of the video. Why I bought this for the third time. Well, the first time I bought it, it was right after the camera came out. I bought it for testing and reviewing and just for general use as a content creator and all sorts of kinds of stuff. But at the time, after I reviewed it, I had other cameras that could do the same job. And after I got a good sense of what the camera was and my issues with it, which I mentioned before, I needed the money from this camera to buy other cameras to test and review, which if you've been watching the channel, you know that's kind of what's going on here is I'm constantly rotating cameras. So that's why I sold the first time. Now the second time, I don't remember the timeline, it might have been late last year. I bought this to use in the studio because, as I said before, this is a fantastic studio camera. And just like the first time, I needed this money to buy other cameras to test and review, so I sold it. So whenever I can, I do invest money into my gear to try to invest in my business and to try to level up all of my gear to get better quality. And so I'm at the point now where I'm trying to sort of increase the quality of some of the stuff in my studio. I know most of you probably think everything looks fine, but as a camera nerd, we're always trying to get our stuff looking a little bit better. So I'm really excited to have the R5C in the studio and do some testing and make some content about. So if you have any questions about the R5C or maybe ideas for videos, things you want me to talk about, there is a playlist on my channel with all the R5C videos, and I'll leave that link down below, but I'll be making some new stuff coming up. So hopefully enjoyed this little chat. I know it was a little rambly, but cool to talk about cameras, and I appreciate all of you checking out this video. If you did enjoy it, please hit subscribe. It'd be greatly appreciated. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.